global trade really started in earnest in the 18th century. Before that, I mean, there was very limited trade in luxury items like spices and gold and silk and so on. But it was only in the 18th century with bigger ocean-going ships and opening up new trade routes and so on that global trade started. In the beginning, a lot of the countries were rather protective of their markets, but for two reasons, the leading nations became supporters of free trade. One was that they were occupying new territories, that they were opening new colonies, they were subjugating other nations, and they basically wanted to be able to sell whatever they wanted to the weaker nations, and they therefore started preaching free trade. Of course, the reality was that while they were doing that, when they found it necessary, they were protecting their own markets. So this age of free trade that ruled the world from, say, late 18th century until the early 20th century was really not a straightforward world of free trade. Especially the US trying to catch up with the European nations, adopting Alexander Hamilton's the infant industry argument, try to develop manufacturing industries in the US through protective walls and government subsidies. Of course, when it became a strong economic nation, the Americans started pushing free trade. So there were a lot of kind of double standards and hypocrisies involved. But broadly speaking, in the from the late 18th to the early 20th century, the global trade was the global trade could be described as largely free, although free for commercial reasons. I mean, that this freedom very often meant that forcing open countries with the military power to engage in that free trade with even when they didn't want it. So that we should use this term free trade advisedly, but that earlier era, so the spread of free trade, and then you had a period between the 1930s and the 1970s when global trade was more regulated. On the one hand, some nations decided to close themselves to the outside world. The rise of communism under the Soviet Union and its spread after the Second World War, and then independence of developing nations, which are often against free trade because they had been forced to engage in free trade by imperialist powers, and they didn't want to go back to the old imperialist order of free trade, so they became more protectionist. And then even in the rich capitalist nations, with the Great Depression and the collapse of the global economy, nations became more cautious about the interaction with the outside world. So, basically, this middle part of the 20th century was an era of much more regulated trade. And then from the 80s, the tide turned the other way because a lot of developing countries got into financial trouble with the so-called third world debt crisis in the mid-1980s, and they had to borrow money from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and these the institutions forced these countries to adopt more liberal policies, especially trade liberalization. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, the Soviet bloc collapsed. And then from the 90s, really you saw the emergence of new world trading order under the aegis of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which was the first international organization to have regulated all aspects of international trade. Before that, between 1947 and 1994, you had this organization called GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which regulated only some aspects of international trade, especially the use of tariffs and subsidies. But with the emergence of the WTO, you began to see that this organization regulating many different aspects of international trade, even including international investment, as far as it is related to international trade, intellectual property rights, once again, insofar as it's related to international trade. But yeah, with the emergence of the WTO, the world trading order became a lot more kind of liberal, and basically we had a period, couple of decades of huge expansion of international trade and continuing liberalization of international trade. Of course, now we are at the crossroads, because now we are seeing the kind of disintegration of the WTO system, because basically the organization was set up as a kind of democratic organization, democratic in the sense of one country having one vote. You know, there's no other international organization that has that kind of arrangement, because in the UN it might be one country, one vote, but 5 permanent members of Security Council have veto. In the World Bank, in the International Monetary Fund, voting is according to your share capital, not one country, one vote. So it's more of a $1, one vote system, although it's not a straightforward $1, one vote. And when the WTO was set up, the rich countries said, for the first time, we are going to have an international organization with one country, one vote. And a lot of developing countries found that quite attractive. And then in practice, it was not run like that. And then the rich countries, you know, try to manipulate the system so that they would usually not be a vote, and they try to, you know, strong arm or even bribe the poorer nations. And then finally, dissatisfied with this, developing nations started to band together to oppose what the rich countries were trying to impose. And then the rich countries said, okay, we cannot run it like run it in the way that we want. So they started disengage. So the WTO has become very weakened and far less effective. We are now seeing possibly another turning point in the international trading regime. But I don't really agree with people who think that, you know, we'll see the kind of the rerun of 1930s, the autarchy, you know, the excessive protectionism and so on. Because now the global economy is linked with each other so closely, it will be impossible, even if you wanted, to have the excessively protectionist policies. You might see some increase in protectionism in some areas, but I don't think that this prediction that, you know, given half a chance that the world will go back to the 1930s, because it cannot.